cooperatives. They've had some help over the past 15 years, some help in the form of some foreign aid assistance, some help in the form of NGO, very strong NGO involvement in the Rwanda coffee sector. They've had some support, but they've created themselves cooperatives that obviously spread risks among the group, people share costs, and they've been able to focus on improving quality, producing better quality coffee. They've been able to build important relationships with importers around the world. They've been able to get the skills they need to produce a really fine cup of coffee, so that today, in fact, Rwanda's a tea culture. They've never traditionally drunk coffee. They've always just exported it. So people needed to learn things like, how do you cup coffee? How do you understand what the right flavors are that get you a $15 pound of coffee rather than a $5 pound of coffee? And these cooperatives have also helped invest in and develop an infrastructure to produce coffee. And what coffee needs are two things. Coffee beans need to be processed quickly, within 8 hours of picking to be the highest quality coffee, and they need to be transported carefully. So what needed to be done was you needed to build washing stations to process cherries, get the pulp off the cherries, get down to the bean quickly, and then you needed to get the beans to a central processing area to be sorted and identified. So all this has taken place over the past 15 years in Rwanda. In a way, I hate to say it, in a way it's almost a big P. But it's not a big P in the following sense. It's almost like a big P plan, because the government said, okay, we think what we need to do is focus on enabling the coffee sector, but in order to enable the coffee sector, we're going to get out of the way. That's pretty much our plan. The plan is, let's get out of the way, let's give people the right incentives to produce high quality stuff, and let's see what happens. So let me talk about that for a few minutes. The results in Rwanda are actually pretty amazing. So the cooperatives that have been able to focus on producing high-quality coffee have been able, on average, to more than double their incomes. This is the building back here is actually a school that was built by the Koch Cooperative with their profits. They were able to replace an old school that was a mud brick school with a twig roof, with a different, much more substantial. When I say mud brick, it's not this stuff. Mud brick disintegrates when it rains, and so you have to rebuild every couple of years. This is like a kiln-dried brick that lasts a whole lot longer. And this building, which unfortunately when I took the picture, I took it in a lousy way. You can't see the top. The top is a corrugated tin roof. So now kids can sit in class when it rains, and it rains a lot in Rwanda, and not get wet, and their floor doesn't get wet, and their books don't get wet. And this was... the cooperative was able to support this effort because they had made enough money selling their coffee to build schools like this throughout the cooperative area. So the impact of higher coffee prices has been pretty dramatic on the ground for more than 50,000 families who are engaged in coffee production across the country. Again, farmers are being paid on average about twice as much. But 2 years ago, one lot of Rwandan coffee, which won an international competition, sold for $25. It was like 57. $25 per pound, like 50-something dollars per kilo. $25 a pound for the product of one cooperative in Rwanda. And these were people who 10 years ago had been selling their coffee for 80 cents a pound. Now, imagine what that means for those people, and imagine what kind of incentives that creates for other coffee farmers in the country who now know we have something really special. We have this amazing product that if we work really hard, we might be able to produce and increase our incomes, maybe not that dramatically, but pretty substantially. So you can see what people do with higher incomes. It does truly make a real difference in their lives, and that's important. It's really important that people feel economically secure because they can do good things like send their kids to school and get their kids medicine when they need them. But this, I think, is actually the understudied part of the story. It's work that I've done over the last couple of years. I think this is a fascinating issue. And the issue is, how is it that working together in a commercial environment brings former enemies together? How do commercial relationships promote an informal reconciliation process? It's not formal. You don't have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission set up. But every day, people in coffee cooperatives are working with their enemies. And every day that they work together, and the more time that goes by, they seem to be more and more willing to move closer in a kind of psychological way to the people that they should really hate. I've done a little bit of work on this with a co-author who's a social psychologist, and she and I went to Rwanda 2 years ago to do surveying work among coffee farmers to ask them, well, are you more willing today, if you've been in a coffee cooperative and you've had repeated exposure to the other person, this other, you can't really say Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda, it's not allowed, but everyone knows who's a Hutu and who's a Tutsi. But you can say, you've worked with this other person for 5 years now, maybe it's been longer. Is your perception of the other person different as a result of this? Do you see that you share goals? Do you see that you have the same sort of intentions for your family? Are you more willing today than you were in the past to have a beer with that person? Are you more willing than you were in the past to allow your children to marry someone from that group? Are you more willing than you were in the past to start a business with that person? And the results that we got, which were pretty preliminary, were in all cases, yes, we are. As a result of working together, having this deep, repeated contact with these other people, we see less ethnic distance between ourselves, and we overwhelmingly feel that we would be more willing to engage in a lot of different kinds of social activities with these people. So I think that's actually really interesting, and we don't talk about that part of commerce a lot. I'm going to quickly tell you about one other example of policy entrepreneurship, which I love talking about in sub-Saharan Africa. And then I'll just very quickly talk a little bit about traditional entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurs, and I'll end and you guys can ask questions. So this other example I want to talk about comes from Namibia, which is the yellow country in the southwestern part of Africa. It's a big, you can see it's a big country and very few people. It is lightly populated. It is the farthest extreme from our crowded planet that you could possibly imagine. It's a very beautiful place. Very strong, if you care about things like this, the Gini coefficient is like ridiculous. There is a very small group of of wealthy people, and then there's all these poor people. And they tend to all be indigenous black Africans because Namibia had been illegally ruled by South Africa until 1990. So the South Africans imposed their apartheid rules in Namibia. So there's a small group of folks who were there who were descendants of original colonists who all tended to be German, and then some South Africans went up there. So that group tends to be much wealthier, and then there are all these poor rural Namibians. Okay, so what's the story of policy entrepreneurship in this country? This country did something incredible. It's just radical. It's an amazing thing. The government gave the rights to manage wildlife to the people. To local people. They didn't, in the past, wildlife had been managed like it is here in the United States. Who manages wildlife here? Government. It's either the state government or it's the Fish and Wildlife Service or it's the National Park System. It's not you and your neighbor. Like, you guys maybe have different kinds of wildlife here in Manhattan, but, it's not like the neighbors in the community are managing the wildlife. In Namibia, in 1996, the government gave the right to manage wildlife to poor rural Namibians who have probably not gone to high school, let alone having PhDs in fish and wildlife biology. These are people whose primary source of income was from herding goats and cattle. They're herders and they're subsistence farmers. Government changes the property rights environment, creating a whole new set of incentives for these people. The sorts of incentives that white Namibians had had since 1975. In 1975, under South African rule, the government said, okay, white people, if you want to put a fence around your property, you can keep any wildlife that's in there. But black people, no, you don't have that right. You can't fence in anything. We, the government, know better. We're going to take care of all that stuff. So what's happened since 1996? Since 1996, now that local people have the right to manage wildlife and essential, they directly benefit from the use of wildlife. Their incentives have shifted from seeing wildlife as a problem and a cost, to seeing wildlife as a benefit, potential benefit anyway, and then B, doing what they can to protect wildlife. In the past, local people had poached wildlife because wildlife were only a cost to them. They were not a benefit unless they were reduced to meat. And that was one way that they could benefit from wildlife. So this is a program called Community-Based Natural Resource Management. That's what the CBNRM stands for. The policy has 4 goals. Number 1, wildlife had pretty much been decimated up in the 1970s, 1980s, up to the 1990s, because there was a civil war with the South Africans. And there had been some droughts, but there wasn't, and there was poaching. So there wasn't a whole lot of wildlife left in this country. So the government wanted to, number 1, conserve what little there was and see if they couldn't get more of it. Number 2, they wanted some economic development in rural areas. It's very tough to create economic development outside of cities. The idea was, well, those white guys created game reserves. Maybe the black people can do something like that, and maybe that'll get some businesses going. The third thing that I think is quite interesting is communities have to form self-governance units to manage their wildlife. So there was an explicit desire to create stronger local governance units through this policy, and that's happened. And then, there's this sort of social capital story. Well, if we allow people to do this sort of thing, to protect the wildlife through groups, what they'll do is they'll engage in some activities, some commercial activities, and that will promote a sense of empowerment. People will not only own the resource, but they'll start doing things like build tourism lodges. That'll give people social capital skills, knowledge, and that'll be empowering also. So Namibia actually today is considered by folks who look at these kinds of programs to be the world's leading example. Anywhere in the world, Namibia is the world's leading example of devolving property rights over natural resources, giving those rights to communities, and seeing what communities do as a result of them. Here's what communities do. This is a lodge and a conservancy. So the local people form together into something called a conservancy. We, in this room, we all get together. We say, okay, we want to manage our wildlife. Let's form a group. Let's write a constitution to govern our relationships. Let's figure out how we're going to protect the game. And then what are we going to do? Are we going to sit around and look at the lions and the elephants in our backyard? People, wildlife is a cost for these people. The only reason they're willing to look out of their windows and see elephants is because they know that people like us are going to go and pay big money to see the elephants. So what they want to do once they form these conservancies is build this stuff. This is a hotel in Teufelfontein Conservancy. It may hold 200 people. It's actually probably the biggest conservancy outside of it's the biggest hotel outside of the national parks. But what communities do, remember again, these are people who probably didn't go to high school. Until recently, their main source of income was herding goats and cattle. They enter into contracts with professional tourism companies who come in and build lodges on conservancy land, and then there's a revenue sharing contract that's entered into. So for this particular lodge, a percentage of every night's revenue for every guest that stays there goes directly to the conservancy. So that's how the conservancy is making money. The contract for this particular lodge also says you have to hire local people whenever they're available. Oh, and by the way, you have to train them so that they eventually can become managers, because at the end of our 30-year contract, this property is going to belong outright to the community. In other words, the company that built this is going to give up its ownership rights unless the community says we want you to stay. It knows it's going to give up its ownership rights, and the community is going to completely take over running this particular business. So local people are trained, they learn new skills, they're no longer just goat herders. Now they're managers, they're bookkeepers, they're accountants, they have all sorts of hospitality skills, all of which are transferable, and their incomes are rising, which is important. Over the past 15 years, here's what's happened in terms of numbers of conservancies in Namibia. The number of conservancies has skyrocketed. People see this is an experiment that's actually working on the ground. If you want to look around the world and say, okay, where's a development project that works? Here's a development project that works. Here's an example of property rights empowering local people, giving them incentives to do good things, and people on the ground are responding themselves. The first conservancies were developed in 1997. There were 5 created that year. This is actually old data. So for 2009, there were 50 conservancies that had been formed by local people, and there were another 23 waiting to be formed. This program has been so successful that in Namibia, now the government gives local people the right to manage forests as well, not just wildlife, if they form these conservancies. Forming a conservancy is a tough job. Imagine if all of us in this room had to get together and we had to draft our own constitution to govern our relations. How long do you think it would take us to do that?